Yeah, well, with that, we'll move on to our second speaker for today, who's Sander Keemink. Sander did his PhD in Edinburgh. He then did some postdoc work in Edinburgh and also in Lisbon with Christian Maschens. And now, as of last year, he's an assistant professor at the Donders Institute in the Netherlands. We met at CoSign this year, and I really liked hearing about his work, and I think everyone will enjoy it today as well. So, Sander, thanks. Sorry, Sander, you're muted.
So I can't interact with Zoom when I'm sharing a screen, apparently. So
I know, it's okay.
There we go. Thanks a lot for the kind introduction and also for the invitation. So I'm presenting a very much work in progress project today that has its root in computational neuroscience. And recently we're trying to push it more into a machine learning context. And so it's super nice to be able to talk to the SNUFA audience and get the SNUFA perspective on this. I hope we'll get some discussion and questions afterwards that are relevant. And so what I'm talking about today is how we can trade off performance and energy in spiking neural networks. And why is this interesting is because we know that, at least we as humans, we can adjust how much energy we're using and adjust how much performance we want out of tasks. So for example, I wrote here in black the best letter in the alphabet, the S. And then as a kind of test of myself, I want to see how well can I trace this black version of the letter with another red letter. And I can use kind of low focus or high focus. And as you see, when I had low focus, I just kind of did a shoddy job of it. And when I used high focus, I had a very high performance. And I was able to trace very precisely. Okay, so this shows that we're able to trade off how much focus or energy we use and how much performance we get out. Just a very simple example, but this is a general case. And so this is kind of a general feature that you want out of any system, biological or artificial. So if there's some system that has some input that has some energy allowance, and that system then has to have an output that is matched to some kind of behavioral target, like tracing the letter, maybe playing tennis in a certain way, etc. Then what is desirable is that if you use more energy, then obviously what you then want is that the error goes down, so that you have higher energy, lower error. But conversely, it's then also very good that if you're in a situation in which you might not need that much performance, maybe I don't need to have a very good trace, I just have to have this general S shape, then it's also nice that you can use less energy and trade it off for a higher error. So this is kind of a general need for any system. And today I'm going to consider how we can think about this trade-off of energy and performance, or energy and error, in spiking neural networks. And specifically, I want to talk about today if you have a spiking neural network. So it's a network, it's recurrent, it's emitting spikes, like they can be integrated via neurons, etc. And the spikes are being emitted. Can we now understand, if it's doing some task, how these SNNs trade off energy and performance? And most importantly, like I kind of semi-demonstrated in the psychophysics of drawing the S, can this trade-off also be adjusted online? So now, to think about performance in spiking networks, we must first think about how do we read out from spiking networks. And the kind of networks I'm going to be talking about today are spiking networks with linear readouts. And generally what you do is you take your network, you generate the spikes, you filter the spikes with an exponential kernel so that you get kind of a more smooth signal, or like think of what the downstream voltages are, what is happening to the downstream voltages. And then you decode that with the decoder matrix D, which gives you the output Y. And if this is a well-trained network or a well-designed network, there will be some target output, here shown on the dotted lines, that the output of this network is very closely tracking. So now what does it mean to have different performances? And that becomes very important to think about what is the magnitude of the decoder weights D. And so the first thing that we can think about is like, what if the, hang on, I'm just moving away the video, there we go. What happens if we have very large decoding weights? And so what I'm showing here is a network with two target outputs in the dotted lines, and the solid lines showing the current readout of this network, and I'm showing the spikes at the bottom. When D is very large, when the decoding weights are very large, this means that whenever a spike happens, you get a big change in the output. And so you get these very large jumps whenever a spike happens, and decay because you're doing an exponential filter. And so what happens with a very large D is that if this network is well trained with a large D, then you can track the signal, but only coarsely, because the jumps with each spikes are very large. Conversely, if we use a much smaller D, now every spike is going to cause a much smaller jump in the readout. And now we can track these signals very precisely. So you have a higher performance, you have a lower error. But this comes with a cost. Because the fact that each D can only contribute a little bit to the readouts, each spike can only contribute a little bit to the readouts, we also need more spikes to track the signal. So we now have a much better tracking of the signal, but it comes at the cost at much more spikes. As you can see here, the spikes are now so many that it just becomes kind of a single line. Okay, so that's kind of, this already establishes that when you have any, and this is true for any spiking network in which you have a linear readout, in that these SNNs that have linear readouts inherently already have a certain trade-off of performance and energy use. Okay, so what do we now mean by performance and energy use? I want to be very specific for the rest of the talk. So when I talk about error, but when I talk about performance, I just mean what is the difference between a target signal and the output signal, and in this case, the total squared loss. And when I talk about energy use, I mean the total activity of the network. And there's a lot of ongoing discussion if this is a good measure of energy, but at least this gives you a bit of a ballpark for how much energy is being used by a network. And so this is kind of the sum across all neurons, and this is the total activity then. And so once you have quantified like this, you can kind of start measuring what is now the trade-off between the energy or activity and the performance or the error. And you can get something like this. So I'm showing you a little example of arbitrary networks, arbitrary input weights, arbitrary recurrent connectivity, arbitrary readout weights, but you can do this in different ways. And so what I'm showing here on the x-axis is the effort firing rate per neuron. And on the y-axis, if we have a well-trained network for a given level of activity that you want the network to be at, what is the error that you get? And what you get in these spiking networks, if you build them well, is that you get these really nice trade-offs, where as you use more energy, if you use more spikes, you get better and better error, as we just saw in these two pictures. So you go from low error to high error, from high activity to low activity. That means you move down this curve. And so the three colors here, or the three types of curves here, are just a reference kind of network that is a Poisson network. It's not really doing anything. It's just a forward network that has Poisson spikes and gives you kind of an upper limit, the lower limit on the error you can have in these. And then we have a trained network that we train to do this with different activity costs. And then you get a semi trade-off like this. And then there's a coordinated network that we designed to be as good as possible at matching a target signal. I'll go a bit into how these work in a bit, and then you get this trade-off. And so this really shows you that there is a very inherent trade-off to using spiking networks in doing, if you want to trade off between energy use and performance. Yeah, and so the problem now though is that we want to be able to do this in an online manner, whereas the way we generated this plot and the way you would generally try to adjust the activity used by a network is by retraining or redesigning the network. So each of these dots here on these curves is actually a completely separate network that we completely re-optimized or redesigned, and so has completely different weights for each of these. And so this does not give us a network that has its online kind of trade-off of the energy use and the performance. So yeah, different trade-offs require re-optimized networks. And so we wanted to see, can we not just build networks that do have this in an online manner, but can we also be able to build them in a way that we understand what is happening in a lot of detail? And like any good machine learner, what you start with is define a new loss function. Like any new loss function will solve all your problems, right? And so in this loss function, we're explicitly trading off for the activity and the error in a single loss function. So on the left here, on the loss, we have the target readout X, and we have the current readout, the activities of the neurons projected to the decoding matrix D. And on the right here, we have the activity loss, in which there is some target activity that we would like the network to be at, compared to the sum of the activity in the network itself. This is the sum over all the activities. And I just want to highlight a few things here. First of all, this kind of total activity loss is nothing new. That's used in a lot of spiking networks to regularize the activity. But what is new that we are comparing it to a certain target level of activity, and we're going to try to see if we can adjust this target activity on the fly and get different level of performances. The second thing is I want to highlight this paper from Sorensen et al. From the lab of Sander Bote, where they look at a very similar problem of how do we define precision in spiking networks and how can we adjust it. And if you're interested in that, check out the talk that Sander gave, the second Sander Bote gave 2 years ago in the SNUFA workshop. The difference here is that we're looking at, we're trying to investigate the precision changes in terms of this loss function. and also in an online manner in recurrent neural networks. But I do recommend checking out both the paper and the talk. Now, there's two ways you can approach these kind of loss functions. The natural thing in a machine learner would think like, okay, I have the loss function, I can just train it now that we have all these good backpropagation algorithms. But what we're first going to look at, because we also want to build a certain level of understanding of what's happening, we're going to also try to analytically derive a network that explicitly solves this loss. And that's what I'm going to start with. So how do you analytically solve a loss with spiking network? That seems kind of tricky, but it has been done for a while now. For certain losses, you can do it. And this is shown in these papers from the labs of Sophie de Neve and Christian Machens. And what you can do is you say, okay, we have a loss, and I'm first only going to consider the coding part of the loss, not the activity part of the loss. If we have a certain coding loss, we can say that we only want a spike to be generated if this loss crosses a certain threshold. And I don't have time today to go through all the derivations of what happens, but just trust me, what comes out of it is that you can derive that a network of integrating fire neurons with a feedback loop that compares the output directly to the input that's then mapped back into the neurons. And that feedback loop is implicitly done in the recurrent connectivity. It's not a feedback loop that you do. I'm just showing it here kind of for illustration. But that this is the network that is directly derived from this loss to optimize so that spikes in this network only happen when the loss is slightly too big. And you can kind of interpret what's happening geometrically. So what I'm plotting here is the stimulus space, x1 versus x2. And what happens is that the network will be spiking in a way such that the readout will be constrained in a certain kind of error allowance around the target stimulus. So in red, you kind of see whenever the readout is within this little box, then nothing will happen. And whenever it leaves this red box, the error allowance, one of the neurons will be above threshold, a spike will be generated, and the readout will be corrected. And what's important here is that everything about this network is completely derived, so that we know exactly what the recurrent connectivity should be like, what the forward connectivity should be like, what the time scale should be like. And what's nice about that is that we also know exactly how to interpret all this connectivity. So we know that the recurrent connectivity determines the error allowance, so how big is this box, and the decoder weights, the size of those tells you whenever a spike happens, how far will the readout jump? So how far is this vector D? And so here's what it kind of looks like in practice. So in gray, I'm going to show the readout of the network in the stimulus space. In the dotted line, I'm going to show you what the network is getting as an input. And the red dots are going to show you whenever a spike happens. And so here you're going to see that the stimulus is moving, and the network is trying to track it with the gray line. And sometimes the error is too big, so a spike is necessary to track. And you can see that the spike keeps happening. And you can kind of think about whenever the spike jumps in a different direction, it's a different neuron spiking with a different decoding. But the real nice thing you see here now is that it's tracking the signal, but it has a very fixed performance, because whenever a spike happens, you jump with a certain distance. And that means that this is going to be tracking the signal within a certain boundary around it, given by the loss, given by the maximum loss that you define. And so this means that performance is fixed in a given coordinated spiking network, as they're called, by the way. And so then you get these signals that can be tracked. You're going to be tracking it. You're going to have some error allowance, and you're going to have some spikes being emitted to track it. And so here you see that it really tracks it quite well over time. But what we really want is a network that does this online. We don't want to keep doing this. We don't want to redefine the network, because the way to think about this network is, okay, we know now how to change the performance and energy use. If we change the recurrent connectivity to change the size of this kind of error allowance, we can adjust how much error we have and how many spikes are being used. And you can go from a very low activity, high error regime with a very large error allowance to a very high activity, low error regime with a very low allowance. But again, to do that, we need to redefine all the connectivity weights in these networks. And so what we do in this project is say, okay, what if we actually don't have a loss that just cares about the signal coding, but also cares about the target signal that is currently there? And you can use the same derivations that they had in the original papers to show that when you take this loss, you say a spike should only happen when the maximum loss is crossed. Then you get a network that has the same kind of feedback loop for the coding part of the loss, but gets a second global feedback loop that is shared across all neurons to code for the second part of the loss, was the activity loss. And now you have a network that has a feedback loop that's kind of taking the rate estimate and comparing it to a target rate that is now an input into the network. So what you get from this derivation is that you get a network that needs the Z as a target signal, as an input signal. You now get this network. The difference now with before is that the error allowance is now depends on what your target rate is. And so here I show kind of 3 different error allowances for the same thing I showed before that changes with when I change the target rate Z. So if you have very low target rate Z, so you're only allowed to fire 1 spike per second, for example, that would correspond to having a much bigger error allowance than if you're allowed to have more spikes. But the problem is that the jump distances remain constant across all of this. So whenever you change Z, we're not adjusting anything about the decoder. And so what you end up with is as you track a signal, and I'm going to change the background signal Z, the target signal Z, I'm going to lower it right now. You see that the signal is no longer able to fully track the input signal. So the gray line is no longer able to track the black signal, but it is tracking the direction. And here I changed the background signal again. But it does track the direction, and it has a kind of fixed kind of precision around its own mean output. So you get kind of the same kind of jump size as before. And so what happens is we can now trade off performance and energy online in the sense that we can adjust the input signal Z. And as you move across time and you change the input signal Z, you see that you get a lower and lower error the higher your Z is until you match the signal correctly. Okay. But this is kind of, it's good. We can trade off energy and performance, but we're trading off bias and energy instead of the variance and the energy. So we're not coding correctly anymore. And so it turns out that you can correct for that. And so the way to correct for that is that you can add a decoder, a multiplicative term to the decoder that adjusts the magnitude of the decoded signal. And then you can go from a signal that's coding for the correct direction but has a bias to a signal that is both coding for the correct direction and has no bias. However, you do trade off with more variance, and so lower precision and performance. And just to mention that this framework that we kind of show here is quite nice, and that we can also change the time scale at which a second feedback loop happens. So at what time scale do you want to adjust your activity at? And that's what we show here. You can do that both by changing the connectivity that you have, but you could also, for example, adjust intrinsic parameters of the neurons, which is kind of a way to link this work to more classic models of homeostasis in biology. And so when you do that, what you end up with is that we now have a system in which you have an error allowance, which is kind of cone-shaped instead of just shown a different direction. So what I'm showing here is along the X and Y axis, kind of the classic coding space we care of. But now we have a third axis, which is kind of the direction along which the activity of the total network changes. And what I'm showing here is that when you change the target rate, but also change the forward drive, you kind of move up and down this cone. I don't have time to go into the detail here, but just believe me that when you change the target rate, you go up, and when you change the forward drive, you go down. And so what you end up with now is that we can draw the same trade-off curves we have been thinking about, like what is now the trade-off of energy and performance in these networks. So here again, the x-axis is population rate, so the energy use, the y-axis is coding error. And I'm showing in 3 colors, 3 different input strengths of signal, what the trade-off is for those cases. And so these networks now end up with that if you change the target rate, you can kind of move along these trade-off curves. So you can really control what is the trade-off I currently want. But also this network is robust to certain changes in the input strength, and that the activity now is stable when we change the input strength, which is shown by the green arrow. Okay, great. So that's we have now an analytically derived network that can trade off these 2 things, but it's not doing it's mostly tracking a signal. And the nice thing is it's derived, so we also have a very nice geometric understanding of what's happening. But can we now also use this understanding we've built to actually use to train networks that do the same thing? And so this is work by Bill Podlasky, who is also in the audience. And what he did is he took inspiration from this analytical approach to say, well, okay, so what we know from that approach is that when we provide a target, the target rate is an additional input to the network. We have a network that could in principle change its precision rate. And so what he then did is you present different fixed inputs. You would also present different target rates, and then just use the kind of now off-the-shelf kind of surrogate gradients for backpropagation. We can then train these recurrent networks to actually do that. And the other thing we did is that we also know from the analytical approach that we need to adjust the readout with a certain factor alpha to take into account any bias you might have, because you're coding for both the signal and some target rate. And so when we do that and you train these networks, you find that when you train networks with different target rates, you get a very nice trade-off of the energy and the performance. Whereas in contrast, when you train the same network on a fixed target rate and don't change it, and then afterwards give it different Zs to the trained networks, you don't get the same kind of trade-off, and you have kind of an optimal point at which your energy is best, and otherwise you have less performance. Right. And so the nice thing is that the coding is still reasonably okay. So here we show for different target signals that the dotted lines are still reasonably tracked by the signal itself. But also that when you look at the network, what's happening inside, and you compare the networks that are trained across different target signals so that they can actually vary their energy use quite well, that you get a difference between, and you compare that to networks that don't have this variable background signal as during training, you see that the networks turn from kind of a mixed inhibitory excitatory population to a fully inhibitory population. And so here you see in gray the fixed networks, and in black the variable networks, in which you vary the target signal during training, and you see that the weights have become mostly inhibitory. And so this means that this network has during training gone from kind of a recurrent forward network to a network where there is a very clear kind of feedback loop, which is comparing the target rate to the network's activity through the inhibitory connectivity. Okay, so kind of to conclude this talk is that we show that all SNNs within the readouts naturally have a trade-off of activity and performance. This trade-off can be controlled in a single network if there's some background input as a target signal and there's a feedback loop. And in the coordinated SNNs that we analytically derived, this results in constraining the error within the cone, which allowed us to use iterations that let us train adaptive networks, which hopefully in the future could also be used in networks that do more interesting computations. Just want to do quick other highlights that are kind of underlying this work, where we kind of more started with this. This target signal that we kind of as arbitrary can be seen as either a feedback signal or a forward signal. And the feedback signal, you can think of it like an attentional signal, which is also quite similar to what was shown in Sander Rote's paper. And finally, the classic coordinated SNNs have a problem that they're not really stable to certain things like voltage noise, excitation, or synaptic delays, excitatory perturbations. Whereas with this kind of feedback that we have implemented now, we get networks that are a lot more stable. And just as a kind of background thing, this is kind of why we started with this project, because we were trying to kind of fix these problems. And it's one of these nice examples where we got to a much more broad understanding of networks from that. So I wanted to acknowledge my collaborators at the Champollion Foundation, with the lab of Christian Machens and Bill Podlaski and Nuna Kaleem from the lab. And also people I've discussed this work with a lot at the Donnes Institute, Nasir Ahmad and Pablo Lanelos, Justus Huberter, and Marcel van Gerven. And with that, I'll leave it. And I apologize for being slightly over time.
Thanks for the great talks.
I'll just put the slides back on if there's questions.
Sure.
To see faces.
Actually, I was wondering, so like this precision term, does it, I'm not sure if I fully understand, like in terms of how it's implemented, does it actually affect any of the like intrinsic parameters of the neurons, or are those sort of fixed, and all it's doing is providing some sort of additional drive onto, like globally onto all of the cells in the recurrent network?
Yeah, so there's kind of two ways to, wait, I'll share it again. Right, so, you know, in the built network or the trained networks, all you have is the target rate that's shared across all the neurons. So you give all the neurons a little bit of extra inhibition or extra excitation, and it allows you to kind of adjust the precision and or adjust the performance. And there's two ways you can adjust the performance. One is say, okay, we don't actually care about the precise magnitude of the signal. we only want to, we only care about coding for the precision, and then you're kind of done. You have a network that already gives you this kind of trade-off, at least in terms of the error, not in terms of the variance. You can also say, actually, I don't like this bias. I want to have networks that have that are coding correctly for what I wanted to code, either for tracking an input signal or doing some computation. I want to adjust the variance around that signal. And at least in these networks, what you then have to do is you have to add an alpha term that
does that affect all the neurons equally, or is that?
Yes, that affects the readout. So yes, it's not actually affecting the neural activity. Okay, it's affecting the effect of the neuron's activity on the downstream neurons.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, for example, that could be implemented in the forward connectivity into the dendrites of the forward neurons, or it could be, there's a few ways it could be done in principle. But this is really talking about like what do you have to do to adjust the code to get this to this particular way of doing it.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah, that's very cool.
I think Alessandro sort of got me thinking about. You may have seen from Dan's lab, we had a paper on using heterogeneous time constants in the networks. So we had spiking networks. Nicholas, one of the PhD students, had spiking networks with heterogeneous time constants. I was wondering how that would interact with also trading off the energy. Like if you would see shifts in the distribution of learned time constants when you also have to trade off energy. Maybe it's hard to say.
That's a very good question, actually, because so one thing we do is we adjust the time constant of the feedback loop that's trying to stabilize the activity rate, the total activity rate. And when you make that much slower, you get a much stronger effect of the feedback loop. And you also get things like, okay, maybe you first get a kind of burst of higher activity that then kind of stabilizes when you change Z or change X. And I have no idea how that would interact if you're actually training it's actually something we should actually add to this training loop at the end. What if we actually train the time constant of the different feedback, if that does something? Yeah, I have no idea what that would do. It's a very good question.
Actually right now you said you're training with these like surrogate gradients but you're only training the weights.
Only the weights, yes.
Only the weight, and the weights are, are you sort of constraining yourself to sort of a Dale's law kind of?
No, we're kind of ignoring Dale's law in this. Yeah, it's true. Yeah, I mean, you could implement it by having a second loop through inhibitory neurons, but I think for this kind of, when you really want to think about the code, it can make a lot of sense to kind of ignore that for a bit. And
yeah. Well.
And the real question moving forward, I guess, is how do we do computation with this, right? Can we do a really good computation that also is adjustable in how precise you're doing that computation? And that's open work.
And actually, is the like really precise architecture inside of this recurrent loop, is that something very handcrafted, or is it very more?
Yeah, so it's handcrafted in the analytical case, but in the train case, we don't handcraft that in, right? Like it just comes from the learning. So
it's just like all-to-all.
It needs to have good performance across different target inputs. And the only thing we tell it is that you can kind of adjust with this alpha term during training, at least. And then what you get out is this inhibitory feedback loop that allows for that. I think one way to think about that is if you have a lot of positive background input in the target rate, and you have any excitation in your network, this can, this is hard to keep stable. Right. So maybe it's learning just to be as stable as possible, and that actually allows you to do this trade-off really nicely. So yeah.
Maybe a bit of a weird question. I was also thinking about if it would be possible to train a network, but then during training you have a fixed energy budget. And so then, every time you process a sample, you use up some of that budget. And yeah, I guess I was just wondering about how that would affect the learning dynamics. So
that's kind of what people do in classic spiker network training, right? You said, you have your target computational loss, and then you add a regularizer to that, which is either the individual activities or the sum of all spike activities across the whole thing, and you add some cost factor to that. The size of that cost factor kind of gives you that budget, right?
Yeah, I guess though what's different with that is that that is like you know, the network spikes roughly, and then you penalize it for spiking too much. I guess what I was wondering is if you'd be able to see something like maybe early in learning, it would use up more spiking, and then that would.
I would actually want to penalize learning itself, actually. Yeah. No, but that, so one difference, I think it is a different to set this target, right? Like you say, normally say, I just want to you just add the activity cost, and you just say, that's just, don't spike too much. That's all it does. Whereas if you actually set like kind of a target set, you actually allow the network, you actually can spike quite a bit, you know, you can go for it a bit. And as long as you don't go too high, don't go too far below. Yeah, it's a good question how that would interact with a lot of these things.